Exactly how much should a buyer in New York City expect to pay in closing costs when buying a property? Well, that's a bit of a complicated question. There is a range, and in fact, many buyers are caught off guard with how much the closing costs may be and the type of closing costs that they may be expected to pay. So let's break it down. Let's talk about some of the key similarities and key differences to help you understand what to expect whenever you're buying in New York City and what kinds of closing costs you will be paying. I'm Dewey Moss. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button, and let's get started. So the first thing to know about closing costs for buyers in New York City is that they are very different than the rest of the United States. You are moving into a very unique market in New York City, and you are paying a premium to buy into the market in New York City. So your closing costs are going to be a bit higher than the national average. If we were to put a percentage around the closing costs, we would give it a range of anywhere from 4% to 10% of the purchase price. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, that's a huge range. How am I going to know what to pay? How much are my closing costs going to really be? A lot of it depends on the kind of purchase that you're making in New York City. If you've watched some of my other videos, I've broken down the kinds of properties that we have in New York City, and those really do dictate the amount of closing costs that you'll have. We have co-ops, we have condos, we have new development, which are often condos, and then we have townhomes in New York City. And all of those properties will have different closing costs associated with them. So let's break it down a little further so that you have a bit more of an understanding of that. And let's start by talking about the kinds of closing costs that all the properties are going to have in common. One portion of the closing costs that remains consistent pretty much no matter what kind of property you're buying are your bank fees. And those bank fees are very similar to fees that are charged by any bank on any transaction out in the rest of the nation. So you're going to have things like your mortgage origination fee, you're going to have an appraisal fee, you're going to have credit report fees, and a whole host of other fees that banks charge. And those are very consistent across all the different kinds of properties. Of course, if you're paying cash, which does happen quite a bit in New York City, you get to avoid all of those bank fees. But for those of you who do need financing, you should expect that those bank fees are going to be very consistent across all the properties and fairly consistent with the rest of the nation. Another closing cost that is very consistent is the cost of an attorney. New York State is an attorney state, which means that an attorney must be involved in the transaction. A real estate agent is going to negotiate the deal and all the terms of the deal for you, but then that information gets handed over to an attorney who then works and negotiates the contract. They're going to do all of your due diligence to make sure that your building is healthy and there are no red flags in your purchase. They're going to work with the other attorney on the seller side, and eventually that attorney is also going to give you a final estimate for all of your closing costs. Attorneys can vary in price. They're most often a one-time fee ranging anywhere from about $3,000 to $5,000. If an attorney is charging less, I would be a little concerned about the quality that you're getting, but again, you would trust your real estate agent that you're working with. Hopefully they work with some really great attorneys that they can recommend to you, but that will be part of your closing cost. One closing cost that many buyers are not aware of is called the mansion tax. A mansion tax in New York is imposed on purchases above $1 million. Now, what does that mean? That means that if you make a purchase that is 1 penny underneath $1 million, you get to avoid the mansion tax. But of course, for many buyers and the costs in New York City, that's not practical. So if you're spending above $1 million, you will be looking at having the mansion tax added into your closing costs. Now, how much is that mansion tax? Well, it's actually on a sliding scale. From 1 million up to 2 million, it's 1%. From 2 million up to 3 million, it's a higher percentage, and it goes all the way up to above 25 million, where I believe it comes in at about 3.5% of the purchase price. For most people in that $1 to $5 million range, you're looking at a couple of percentage points of the purchase price that's going to be paid in mansion tax and added into your closing costs. Another thing that is consistent across the different kinds of properties, though the amount may be variable, are the building charges. So a co-op, a condo, they're all going to have applications or board packages. They're very large financial applications that you must submit to the boards of these buildings. Those will all have charges associated with them. So they may charge an application fee of $750 up to $1,000. It's a way for buildings to make money and to have income coming in to help support the building. So you can expect that the building itself is going to have some additional charges that will get added in to your closing costs. There are some other kinds of taxes that actually may come to the buyer. For example, a building may have what's called a transfer tax, which is another way of the building to make money. It's often paid by the seller, but some sellers will insist that their buyers pay that. So that may be an additional closing cost as well. Those kinds of things are negotiable. So if a seller is trying to make a buyer pay the transfer tax, a buyer can come back and try to negotiate, maybe pay half, or maybe even get the seller to pay the full transfer tax. It's generally paid by the seller in most cases. However, it can be forced on the buyer, and there's another part of your closing costs. And of course, there are some other fees and taxes from New York State and New York City that are going to get added in, and some miscellaneous fees that are going to contribute to the closing costs and are consistent across every kind of building that you would be buying into in New York City. Now, let's talk about some of the closing costs that are not in common depending on which property you buy. And this may factor into the kind of purchase that you make. Co-ops tend to be more economical in terms of closing costs as opposed to new development and condos or townhomes. And here's why. If you've watched any of my other videos, you have learned that co-ops are not real property. You're buying shares in a shareholder-owned company that owns the building. So you have shares in that company, and those shares are assigned to a proprietary lease that allows you to live in the apartment. So as a result, you do not own any real property in a co-op. With a condo, you are actually buying the real property. You're buying that unit and you own real property that is subject to property taxes and everything else that real property is subject to. As a result, with a condo, you're going to have a couple of additional taxes. First thing you're going to have is a mortgage tax in New York City, and that is a big one and a very large expense added into your closing costs. However, because you don't own any property on a co-op, you will not have a mortgage tax because you're not taxing real property. You own shares in a co-op. Another kind of closing cost that only applies to real property is title insurance, which may sound very familiar to people who have bought houses and such out in the rest of the nation. Title insurance is required on real property. However, you can avoid that cost by buying a co-op because you own shares, you don't own real property. In addition, you can expect that condos will generally charge a few more fees than what co-ops will charge. In addition to those application fees that we mentioned earlier, a condo may charge something like 2 or 3 months worth of maintenance up front. That is a special contribution to go into their reserve funds. The reserve funds are used to help keep the building healthy or do any repairs, so they generally ask for a contribution. Many condos have an on-site manager or on-site super, and because this is real property, wherever the super or that manager lives has to be maintained. So they may ask for a one-time contribution to help support the living area for the super or the manager. So in general, because of those additional charges and taxes that come along with condos, you can expect that there may be a 10% difference between the closing costs on condos and co-ops. Much of these taxes and other fees and more do apply if you're buying a townhome, because with a townhome, you are buying real property. You are buying an entire structure. So there are going to be additional taxes, there are going to be additional fees fees, and there are going to be additional inspection costs and such that are going to mount up when you're buying a townhome in New York City. And then finally, if you're buying a condo that is a brand new development, well, guess what? Developers love to push all of their seller closing costs onto the buyer. It is not uncommon for closing costs on new development to be upwards of $40,000 or $50,000 by the time you've paid for all of the attorneys that the sellers have used, their fees, by the time you've paid some other taxes that normally the seller would buy. Because it is new development and the developer has felt like that they have developed this, they feel like they have the right to push all of those closing costs onto the buyer. However, I will let you know up front that those closing costs are always negotiable, and you should work with a great agent who understands new development and understands what can and cannot be negotiated on behalf of the buyer when it comes to those very high closing costs. Okay, there you have it. I hope that this has answered some of your questions and provided some good broad guidance on what to expect with closing costs in New York City. If you're working with a really great agent and a terrific attorney, you will know what to expect up front when it comes to closing costs, and at least get a good estimate so that you're not taken off guard and not surprised by the amount of closing costs associated with buying in New York City. Okay, I'm Dewey Moss. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you next time.